So tonight we're going to be looking at a couple of parables that both deal with prayer. And they may not seem like they are very much connected with each other, but Jesus puts them next to each other in the book of Luke as he's teaching. And so we're going to look at both of these and see what at least one connection is between them after we look at each of them. But we're going to begin with the parable of the unjust judge, or the persistent widow, or I suppose there's some other ways that we might title this. But in Luke chapter 18, in verses 1 through 8, it says, "Then he spoke a parable to them, that men always ought to pray and not lose heart, saying, There was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God nor regard man. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him, saying, Get justice for me from my adversary. And he would not for a while, but afterward he said within himself, Though I do not fear God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. Then the Lord said, Hear what the unjust judge said. And shall God not avenge his own elect, who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth?" All right, so he tells us the purpose behind the parable, that it is to teach us that men always ought to pray and not lose heart. And so when we look at this parable, we find that there are two characters in it. There's the judge who did not fear God or regard man, and there's a widow who needed justice from her enemies, her adversaries. And this is, most of the time when we talk about parables, we're talking about laying beside, something that's parallel. But sometimes we have this little bit of a variation in how they're presented, in that there's actually a contrast. So in this case, the judge represents God, but not as a parallel to God, but rather as a contrast to God. So God is in that position, but he is very different from this judge who is unjust and doesn't care about God or man. And so we have that contrast in this case. And then you have this widow who needs justice from her enemies or adversaries, and the parallel to that, which is a parallel now, is God's elect who cry out day and night for vengeance against their adversaries. And so he says that the judge gave justice to keep the woman's continual coming from wearing him out. So this man didn't care about right or wrong, this judge did not, but he cared about himself and being tired by this woman keeping coming, asking for the same thing, and so he gave her justice. And he says, now, God may bear long, but he is going to eventually swiftly avenge his elect who keep crying out to him day and night. But then Jesus asks this question at the end, will God find faith when he comes again? And I think the idea there is, when he comes to answer that prayer, will people still have faith? Right? Will we give up hope since we don't see the answer coming quickly enough for us? The idea of the parable is that we should pray always and not lose heart. And so when he talks about this, he's saying that you can lose faith by just giving up. And so when we look at this parable, we see it's both a parallel and a contrast. You have this unjust judge that does not really represent God. He's in contrast with God, The point is, even if somebody like that will eventually bring justice, how much more the God who is truly just? And we have another contrast in the idea that even when somebody goes to an unjust judge, they might be so persistent. They might keep going until they receive what they're seeking because it's that important to them. But we will often give up on the just God, and we will lose our faith in him because we've asked him and he hasn't answered that prayer like we wanted. And so he says, God may bear long, but he will bring the justice that we're seeking. Now, in this particular parable and the point that Jesus makes, the only thing directly mentioned here that God is going to answer is that God is going to bring justice from our enemies, right? So we have adversaries, those that are persecuting his people. If we continue to have faith and continue to pray for justice, God will bring justice. All right, if we keep praying and don't lose hope. I think we see this kind of a picture in the book of Revelation a bit as well, where God said, a little while, still wait a while, but he was going to bring it. And at a certain point, he brought it very swiftly. And so that's the basic point of this parable. Now, I think we can find some additional ideas regarding this in other places where we see that, if we're persistent in our prayers and it's things that are according to the will of God, things that are good, that God will answer that prayer. This is one of those things where we know it's God's will. We know if someone is persecuting God's people, God does not approve of that. And so we have this promise that if you will just keep praying and don't lose hope, God will bring that justice about. But don't lose faith. Don't lose hope. Just keep on praying. All right, and the other parable that comes right after this one is the parable about the prayers at the temple, where you have the Pharisee and the tax collector. And this is found also here in Luke chapter 18, and we want to read verses 9 through 14 now. Also he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all I possess. And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, this is one of those parables that it's not really a whole lot of paralleling. It's almost just a story of this is how things really are. But there is a little bit of a parallel in this story to how we can make application of it today. So when you look at this parable, it tells us that the purpose of it was to talk about those who trust in themselves that they are righteous and they despise others. And so we see that a Pharisee and a tax collector go to the temple. The Pharisee is someone who is known for his religion. They're very strict with the law of God. They're respected. And then you have the tax collector who's known for his job that's often connected with corruption. Okay, so the tax collectors were known as people who would be greedy. They would demand more money than what the Roman government actually required, and they would keep the extra money. And so there was a lot of corruption involved in tax collecting at that time. And they were very much hated by most of the Jews. We see that in a number of places throughout the scriptures. And so we see that these two people go. One of them, very religious. He's respected in the community because of how religious he is. And one is looked down on because he has a job that's very often connected with corruption. And so you find their different prayers. They're going to the temple. Now, we don't go to a physical temple today, but the idea is they're appearing before God. They're talking to God. And the Pharisee is thanking God for how good he is. Now, I want us to recognize he thanks God. He does say, thank you for how good I am. And so, it's not just bragging, right? He's thanking God. And yet he is bragging. He's boasting. He believes that he is good in himself, even if he gives thanks to God for that. But he believes that he is better than other people. And Jesus is saying, no, he's really not. And we can easily become like this. The one who is known for his religion can easily be the same person who thinks highly of himself. When you're respected by other people because you're so religious, because you're so strict, because of all these things, it's easy to start thinking, yeah, I really am better than other people. I really am, a better person than this drunkard on the road. I am somebody who is worth something, and I'm thankful to God that I am in myself so much better than other people. And yet that is a terrible way to think, Jesus tells us. The tax collector is humble, and he asks for mercy because he can see that he is a sinner. And when we see that we are sinners, we will be the ones looking for mercy. We'll be looking for the grace of God because we know that we cannot stand justified before God because of how good we are, because we're not good. And when you look at that idea, the one that is not highly respected for his religion, maybe, they are recognized for their failings in life, the problems that they have, or they're connected with very problematic things, they may be the ones who recognize their failings easier. Now, that's obviously not always the case, just like the one who's known for his religion isn't always prideful. But it is easier for someone who is looked down on to recognize that, yeah, there's a reason I'm looked down on. There's a reason why people don't have that respect for me. It's because I really have done a lot that is wrong. And so it's when we look at this parable, we need to look at ourselves and think about, where do we fit in all of this? If I'm a very religious person, which I hope all of us are, do we think of ourselves as better than other people? We've just been learning about holiness from Brother Gazu. If we're living holy lives, does that make us better than the people that are living unholy lives? Well, it's better for us, isn't it? But it doesn't make us worth something to God in itself, because we've already been unholy. That's the point. We have sinned. And that Pharisee, he had sinned, but he didn't recognize his sin. He just looked at the good things that he did. He didn't think about his failings, his sin before God. And so he never asked for forgiveness. He didn't ask to be justified by the grace of God. He thought he was justified by how good he was, and he was not. The one who was humble and asked for mercy is the one who received mercy and therefore went home justified, rather than the other. When we look at the end of this last parable, Jesus says that the one who prayed for mercy went home justified. The Pharisee didn't get that justification because he did not see that he needed it. He never asked for it. He just talked about how good he was and thanked God for that. And I don't think it's necessarily wrong to thank God for the changes he's made in our lives, that we are no longer doing some of the evil things that we did before. But recognize that that's because that's good for us, not that it makes us better than other people or worth more than other people. We're still sinners like everybody else, and therefore we need the grace of God just like everybody else. And so when we have that humility, we can be justified. But if we exalt ourselves, we will be humbled by God. When we go back to the first parable, and we look at the idea of the justice against our enemies or our adversaries, we can also think about that as being vengeance against the guilt of sin. I don't know if that's the real point there, but we can make that connection because sin and the guilt of sin is our greatest enemy. And yet, if we continue patiently having faith in God, God will bring vengeance. He will destroy that guilt. He will destroy that sin if we keep seeking it from Him and do not lose faith. But when we talk about this faith, will there be faith on earth when He comes? Your faith has to be in God, not in yourself. That was the problem with the Pharisee. He trusted in himself. And it's easy for us to start trusting in ourselves. You know what? I'm really good. I'm going to go to heaven because of how righteous I am. But you're not righteous. I'm not righteous. Not in ourselves. We have to trust in God to make us righteous. That we have a righteousness that comes from Him, not from ourselves. If we want to be justified, we're not going to find that in how we have behaved, because we have all sinned. We're going to find that justification in how great God's mercy is, with Him forgiving our sin through the death of Jesus, where He took the penalty. Therefore, we can be relieved of that guilt and be justified in the sight of God. That's where our faith has to lie, in God's mercy, not in ourselves. We are not better than others, except that God is great, and God has blessed us with forgiveness. He has blessed us with teaching so that we can be holy, which is superior to unholiness, like light is to darkness. But it's not in us that this greatness lies. It's in God, in what He's done for us. And we trust in Him, and that's why we live that way. Not because we are better, but because we follow a God who is better. All right, that's the lesson for tonight. I hope that's helpful to you. Thank you.